Hello, and welcome everyone to a brand new story. Today we travel to a small English village called St. Mary Mead, where life always seems so peaceful. But behind every peace, there sometimes lies a hidden secret. In this village stood a certain house where, in every season, whether summer or winter, a vase of fresh white lilies always stood. No one knew where those flowers came from, certainly never from the market. Then one morning, when news of the house's owner's death spreads through the whole village, everything is just as it always was, except for one thing. That day, the vase was empty. This silence, this empty vase, was this the very first hint toward the true secret? Let us begin this mysterious tale, the lily vase that signaled death. The empty vase. The morning was grey in the way that only an English autumn morning can be grey. Not unpleasant, merely thoughtful, as though the sky itself had not yet decided what sort of day it wished to be. Miss Marple, who had risen early as was her habit, stood at her window with a cup of tea cooling in her hand and looked out over her garden, where the last of the Michaelmas daisies were making a valiant show against the coming frost. It was Mrs. Hartnell who brought the news, arriving at the cottage in a state of breathlessness that Miss Marple found, on the whole, rather becoming to her. Mrs. Hartnell was not a woman naturally suited to drama, being large and practical and given to discussing the price of fish with more animation than she discussed anything else. But this morning she had clearly stumbled upon something that even she recognized as extraordinary. "Miss Marple, have you heard? It's Miss Fenwick. She's been found dead this morning. Annie found her, in her chair by the window, quite cold, poor thing, and the doctor's been sent for, though what use that is now I'm sure I don't know." Miss Marple set down her teacup with the particular care of a woman who has learned, over many years, that sudden movements rarely improve a situation. "Dead," she repeated. "Dear me, how very sad. Was it her heart, do you suppose? She always did look a little pale to me, though I dare say that was merely her natural colouring." "Nobody knows anything yet," said Mrs. Hartnell, settling herself into the wicker chair without being asked, which was rather typical of her. "But Annie is in a dreadful state. She says Miss Fenwick was sitting quite peaceful, as if she'd just fallen asleep, except that she hadn't, of course, because she was dead. And the strange thing is, well, I don't suppose it's really important, but Annie mentioned the vase was empty." The vase? Miss Marple's needles, which had been moving with their usual gentle rhythm, paused for the briefest of moments. "You know the one, the white lilies she always kept on the hall table. I don't believe I have ever passed that house, not once in 15 years, without seeing fresh lilies in that vase. Even in January, if you'll credit it, when there's not a lily to be had for love or money in the whole county. And this morning, for the first time that anyone can remember, it was quite empty." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, though her eyes had taken on the mild, unfocused look that those who knew her well would have recognized as a sign that she was thinking a great deal more than she appeared to be. "How very curious," she said softly, and let the subject drop, though it did not drop from her mind. Miss Amelia Fenwick had lived in St. Mary Mead for as long as most people could remember, in a handsome old house called the Laurels, set back from the lane behind a hedge that she had always kept trimmed with more precision than most gardeners troubled themselves with. She was a woman of some 70 years, tall and spare, with a face that had once, people said, been quite beautiful, and manners that were unfailingly correct, without ever being warm. She kept to herself, received few visitors, and was attended by a single housekeeper, a quiet woman named Annie Trent, who had been with her some 11 years and who was, by all accounts, devoted to her mistress in the undemonstrative way that long service tends to produce. She had no family in the village, though it was known that a nephew, a Mr. Gerald Fenwick, visited occasionally from London, not often, and not, according to the general opinion at the vicarage tea-table, out of any great affection. By 10:30, the news had travelled the length of the High Street and back again, gathering embellishments as it went, in the manner of all village news. By the time it reached the vicarage, It had acquired the suggestion of foul play, though no one could have said with any confidence where this suggestion had originated. Dr. Haydock's car had been seen outside the Laurels, and shortly afterwards, a second car, unfamiliar to most, which turned out to belong to Inspector Slack, summoned from the county town. Miss Marple, who had finished her tea and her knitting row, put on her hat and gloves and walked, as she often did of a morning, in the general direction of the High Street. Not, she would have said if asked, with any particular purpose, but simply for the air. She encountered Dr. Haydock coming out of the chemist's, looking, she thought, rather more grave than the ordinary business of a death in the village usually warranted. "Good morning, Doctor. I hear poor Miss Fenwick has died." Dr. Haydock, who had known Miss Marple for a great many years and had long since given up being surprised by how much she knew almost before he did himself, regarded her with the particular expression of a man deciding how much to say. "Morning, Miss Marple." "Yes, very sad business. Though I don't mind telling you, it's given us all a bit of a puzzle." "A puzzle?" "Between you and me, and I'd be obliged if you'd keep it so for the present. It doesn't look quite as straightforward as a woman of 70 simply dying in her chair. There are one or two things that want explaining." He glanced at his watch, as busy men do when they wish to end a conversation without seeming rude. "I really can't say more than that at present. Slack's up there now, and I dare say we'll know a good deal more by this evening." "Of course," said Miss Marple mildly. "One mustn't gossip about such things before the facts are known, though I did hear, from Mrs. Hartnell, you understand, so I cannot vouch for it, that the vase in the hall was empty." Dr. Haydock looked at her rather sharply. "Now why," he said, "should that interest you?" "Oh, it doesn't, particularly," said Miss Marple, with the air of a woman not wishing to make too much of a small observation. "Only it does seem rather odd, doesn't it? Miss Fenwick was so very particular about her lilies. I remember old Mr. Trevelyan once remarking that you could set your watch by them, fresh every week, whatever the season, and nobody in the village ever quite knew where they came from, because they certainly never came from Mr. Bantry's shop, and he has the only decent flowers for sale within 10 miles. I always thought there was something rather touching about it. A woman like Miss Fenwick, so correct and so cool in her manner, keeping something so soft and so constant. It made one wonder." "Wonder what?" "Oh, nothing in particular," said Miss Marple, though her faded blue eyes were, for a moment, not vague at all. "Only that when something a person has done faithfully, for years and years, without fail, suddenly stops, well, it generally means that something else has stopped too. Don't you think so, Doctor?" Dr. Haydock, who was a sensible man and did not care to be drawn into speculation before he had proper grounds for it, said only that he must be getting on, and left her standing outside the chemist's with her basket over her arm and a thoughtful expression on her gentle, wrinkled face. She did not go home immediately. Instead, she walked on a little further, past the turning that led up to the Laurels, and stood for a moment looking at the house from a respectful distance. At the trimmed hedge, the neat gravel path, the tall sash windows with their curtains still drawn, as though the house itself had not yet been told that its mistress would not be requiring them opened that morning. Somewhere, she thought, someone had been bringing lilies to that house, week after week, year after year, in every season, and had told no one. And this morning, for the first time, the lilies had not come. It was, Miss Marple reflected, turning at last towards home, a very small thing to notice. But then, in her experience, it was so very often the small things that mattered most, the things that seemed, on the surface, to have nothing whatever to do with anything, and which everyone else was inclined to overlook entirely. She quickened her step a little, suddenly eager to be home, where she might sit quietly with her knitting and think the matter over properly. A question of sherry. Inspector Slack was a man who prided himself on getting to the bottom of things quickly, and it was this very quality, Dr. Haydock sometimes thought, that made him rather less good at his work than he believed himself to be. He stood now in the hall of the Laurels, notebook in hand, looking about him with the brisk, faintly impatient air of a man who considered most country deaths to be regrettably dull affairs of weak hearts and slippery bath mats, and who resented anything that threatened to make the morning more complicated than it needed to be. "Well, Doctor," he said, "what have we got?" Dr. Haydock had come down from the bedroom above, where the body of Miss Amelia Fenwick had been found, not in her bed as one might have expected, but in the small sitting room that overlooked the garden, seated in her usual chair by the window, with a book fallen open on her lap, and her hands folded, as Annie Trent had said, quite peacefully, as though she had simply drifted off to sleep and never woken. "That's rather the trouble," said Dr. Haydock slowly. "On the face of it, I'd have said heart failure, and I'd have signed the certificate without a second thought if it weren't for one or two things that don't sit right with me." "Such as?" "There's a faint smell about her, about the mouth, and on the glass there by her elbow, bitter almonds, or something very like it. Now, that's not conclusive. Some people can't smell it at all, and I may be wrong, but I've seen enough of these cases to want it looked at properly before I put my name to anything. I've sent for the analyst. Until we hear from him, I'd rather not commit myself." Inspector Slack looked for a moment rather less impatient than before. "Poison, you mean?" "I mean I don't know, and I don't intend to guess in a matter of this kind. But I'll tell you this much. If it is what I think it might be, it's not the sort of thing that gets into a person's system by accident. And there's another thing." He nodded towards the small table beside the window and the empty glass upon it. "She had her cocoa last night, same as always, Annie tells me. 9 o'clock, regular as clockwork. The cup's been washed up already, unfortunately. Annie did it first thing, before she found her mistress, not knowing anything was wrong, poor woman, but this glass here, this wasn't cocoa. Smells of something else. Sherry, I should think, though I'll leave that to the analyst too." Inspector Slack made a note, pressing rather hard upon the paper as he did so, as though the very act of writing might force the facts into better order. "Anyone in the house besides the housekeeper? No one lives here but Annie Trent. There's a nephew who visits from time to time, I understand, but he's in London, or was, as far as anyone knows. We'll want him found and spoken to." Slack looked about the room with the air of a man determined not to miss anything, and his eye fell, as Dr. Haydock's had already done, upon the small brass vase that stood upon the hall table, visible through the open sitting-room door. It was, Slack noted without particular interest, entirely empty. No water, no flowers, nothing but a faint ring of dampness at the bottom, where something had evidently stood until quite recently. "Housekeeper says she always keeps flowers in that," he said, more to himself than to the doctor. "Odd sort of thing to fuss about, this morning of all mornings." "You might ask her about it, all the same," said Dr. Haydock, with a mildness that did not entirely conceal the fact that he had been rather struck by the same detail, though he could not for the life of him have said why. Miss Fenwick was known for it in the village, fresh lilies, whatever the season. It was something of a local curiosity. "Flowers," said Slack, in the tone of a man who did not consider flowers to fall within the proper scope of a murder investigation. "Can wait. Let's have the housekeeper in." Annie Trent, when she came, was a woman of perhaps 50, small and neat, with the reddened eyes and trembling hands of someone who had had a very great shock indeed and had not yet had time to recover from it. She sat where Slack indicated, on the edge of a hard chair, and answered his questions in a low voice, twisting her handkerchief between her fingers. "I found her at 7:30, sir, same as always. I brought her tea up first, to her room, but she wasn't there, and the bed hadn't been slept in, which did surprise me, though I thought perhaps she'd fallen asleep in her chair, which she did sometimes of an evening, being fond of her book. So I came down, and there she was, just sitting, and I thought at first she was only sleeping, and I said, 'Miss Fenwick, your tea, quite ordinary, the way I always did,' and then I saw her hands, and I knew." "What time did you last see her alive, Mrs. Trent?" "It's Miss Trent, sir, if you please. I brought her cocoa at 9, same as every night these 11 years. She was reading. in that same chair, and she said good night to me, quite ordinary, and I went to bed myself soon after. I heard nothing in the night, nothing at all. And this morning, when you came down, did you notice anything unusual? Anything out of place?" Annie Trent hesitated and glanced, almost involuntarily, towards the hall. "The vase was empty, sir. I don't know if that signifies anything, but I did notice it, because it never is. Not once, not in all the years I've been here, has that vase stood empty of a morning." "So I understand," said Slack, without much enthusiasm. "Where do these flowers come from, Miss Trent? Not from the village shop, I gather." "No, sir, never. They came." She stopped, and there was something in her face, some small hesitation, that a more patient observer than Inspector Slack might have found interesting. "They came privately, sir, left at the garden gate, always early, before I was up myself most mornings. I never knew who brought them. Miss Fenwick never said, and I never asked. It wasn't my place to ask." "You never saw anyone bring them? Never caught sight of a face, a figure, anything at all?" "Never, sir. They were simply there, on the step, wrapped in the same brown paper, every week, regular as Sunday. I used to think it very romantic, if you'll forgive me saying so, like something out of a story. But Miss Fenwick never spoke of it, and I never pressed her." "And they didn't come this morning?" "No, sir, not this morning." Annie Trent's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "And I can't help feeling, sir, that it means something. I couldn't say what, but 11 years is a long time to watch a thing happen without fail, and then to have it stop, on the very morning she died. It doesn't seem right to me. It doesn't seem like chance." Inspector Slack closed his notebook with the air of a man who had heard a great deal of sentiment and very little evidence, and privately resolved to give the matter of the flowers no further attention than politeness required. It was, after all, a small thing, the sort of detail an old woman's superstition might fasten upon, and nothing more. He would, in time, come to regret this judgment rather bitterly. But that morning, standing in the neat hall of the Laurels, with the empty vase catching the pale autumn light, he saw only an eccentricity, and turned his attention instead to the more promising business of establishing precisely who stood to benefit from Miss Amelia Fenwick's death, and where each of them had been the night before. It did not occur to him, as it would occur, before very long, to a certain elderly lady in a cottage garden not half a mile away, to ask a rather different question. Not who had benefited from the death, but who, for 11 quiet years, had been so faithfully, so secretly, so patiently in love. What the housekeeper knew. By the time Inspector Slack had finished with Annie Trent for the moment and gone off to telephone the county headquarters about the analyst's report, Miss Marple had made her way, by the most natural route in the world, to the back gate of the Laurels, where she found Annie Trent sitting on the kitchen step with a cup of tea she was not drinking, looking, Miss Marple thought, very much in need of someone to talk to who was not a policeman. "My dear Annie," said Miss Marple, leaning over the low gate in the manner of a woman merely passing by and pausing out of neighbourly concern, "what a dreadful morning you have had. I did wonder whether you might like a little company. One so often finds that policemen, however well-meaning, are not the most comforting people to have about the house." Annie Trent looked up, and something in her tired face relaxed very slightly at the sight of Miss Marple's mild, sympathetic countenance over the gate. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's kind of you. I don't mind saying I'm quite done up. The inspector's been asking me questions this last hour, and I've told him everything I know, which isn't much, and yet he looks at me as though I'm keeping something back. How very trying for you." Miss Marple came through the gate, without exactly having been invited, and settled herself on the low wall beside the step, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "I am sure you have nothing whatever to keep back, but perhaps, if it isn't too painful, you might tell me a little about yesterday. Sometimes it helps to speak of ordinary things. After a shock, it settles the mind, I always find." Annie Trent seemed glad enough of the invitation. She began, hesitantly at first, to describe the day before, an entirely unremarkable Tuesday by her account. Miss Fenwick had risen at her usual hour, taken her usual breakfast, spent the morning with her correspondence, and the afternoon in the garden, weather permitting, which it had, just barely. She had received no visitors, made no unusual remarks, eaten her dinner with her usual small appetite, and retired to her sitting room with a book, as she did every evening of her life. She wasn't a woman for surprises, Miss Fenwick, said Annie, with the ghost of a fond smile. Everything had its place and its hour. I sometimes teased her, not to her face, of course. I wouldn't have dared, but I used to think to myself, you could set a clock by her better than by the church tower. And yet, said Miss Marple gently, there was the matter of the flowers. That was hardly a small habit to keep up so faithfully, and in such secrecy. It suggests, does it not, that somewhere beneath all that regularity there was a very great deal of feeling. Annie's hands stilled on her teacup. I did wonder sometimes, she admitted. She wasn't a demonstrative woman, Miss Fenwick. Cold, some in the village called her, though I never thought it fair. She was kind to me in her way, though she'd never have said so outright. But when those flowers came, of a Monday morning, I'd see her face, when she thought no one was watching, and it wasn't the face of a cold woman at all. It was, Annie searched for the word, it was soft, just for a moment, and then she'd put them in the vase herself, always herself, never let me touch them, and by the time she came down to breakfast, she was quite herself again, brisk and correct, and nothing more was said. Did she ever receive letters along with the flowers? Or any message at all? Never that I saw, ma'am, only the flowers, wrapped in brown paper, left on the step before I was up. I did think once. Annie stopped herself. Yes? It's nothing really. Only once, perhaps 8 months back, I woke earlier than usual, and I thought I heard the gate. I looked out of my window, but I couldn't see anyone, only a shape, moving off down the lane, in the grey of the morning, too far off and too dim to make out. I never mentioned it to Miss Fenwick. It didn't seem my place. Miss Marple's needles, which she had, as always, brought with her, moved a little faster. A man, would you say, or a woman? I couldn't rightly tell you, ma'am. It might have been either. Tallish, I thought, and not hurrying particularly. Walking as a person walks who knows exactly where they're going, and has walked the same road 100 times before. This last detail Miss Marple turned over in her mind with particular attention, though she gave no outward sign of it, merely nodding and remarking that it must have been a very cold morning to be about so early, which led Annie naturally on to other matters. The state of the garden, the difficulty of keeping the range properly blacked, the general unsatisfactoriness of the butcher's boy, all of which Miss Marple listened to with every appearance of interest, while privately storing away the one fact that seemed to her to matter, that whoever brought the Lilies to the Laurels had done so for years, in perfect secrecy, and had done so, moreover, with the ease and confidence of long habit. It was not, she reflected, the behaviour of a stranger, nor even of a casual acquaintance. It was the behaviour of someone who had walked that particular lane, in that particular grey hour, for a very long time indeed, long enough that the walking itself had become as natural as breathing. She did not have long to sit with these thoughts before Inspector Slack himself emerged from the house, looking a good deal less pleased with the morning's progress than he had at its outset, and cast a look of some surprise, not entirely free of irritation, upon finding Miss Marple established on the garden wall as though she had every right to be there. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to find you here. I was merely passing, Inspector, and stopped to offer poor Annie a little comfort. It has been a very great shock to her, as I am sure you understand." "Quite so, quite so." Slack had the harassed look of a man who had spent the better part of an hour establishing facts that seemed, on reflection, to lead nowhere in particular. "Well, since you're here, perhaps you can tell me something useful. You know this village better than anyone, I dare say. Who had reason to wish Miss Fenwick ill?" Miss Marple considered this with the air of a woman giving the question its full and proper weight. "That is rather difficult to say, Inspector. Miss Fenwick was not, I think, a woman who inspired strong feeling of any kind in most people. She kept herself so very much to herself. There is her nephew, of course, Mr. Gerald Fenwick, who visits occasionally, though I understand not always on the happiest of terms. Young men in London do so often find themselves in need of money, and elderly aunts are so frequently expected to supply it. We're sending for him now. Anyone else? There is Dr. Meacham, of course, though I hardly think— Miss Marple stopped, as though she had thought better of finishing the sentence. Dr. Meacham? Slack's pencil hovered. The old fellow who retired a few years back? What's he got to do with it? Oh, nothing at all, I am sure, said Miss Marple, with the particular vagueness she reserved for occasions when she wished to say a great deal while appearing to say very little. Only that he and Miss Fenwick were acquainted for a very long time, since before the war, I believe, when he first came to the district. One does hear things in a village about people's pasts, though I dare say most of it is nothing more than idle talk, and one really oughtn't to repeat it. I'd be glad if you would, all the same, said Slack, with the resigned air of a man who had learned over several previous cases that Miss Marple's idle talk was very often worth a great deal more than his own careful deductions. Well, said Miss Marple, folding her hands over her knitting, it is only that I remember, though I may be quite wrong, my memory is not what it was, that there was some talk, many years ago, of an understanding between Dr. Meacham and Miss Fenwick, when they were both a good deal younger. Nothing came of it, of course. These things so seldom do, in villages, where families have such very definite ideas about what is suitable. But I have always thought it a little sad, and I have sometimes wondered— She paused and looked, for a moment, out towards the lane, in the direction, though Slack did not know it, of Dr. Meacham's own small house, some quarter of a mile distant, where a well-tended greenhouse stood behind a screen of yew, quite invisible from the road. Wondered what, Miss Marple? Oh, nothing of any consequence, Inspector, said Miss Marple, resuming her knitting with an air of closing the subject. Only whether some attachments, once formed, are ever entirely given up. I have found in my experience that they very rarely are. The nephew from London. Gerald Fenwick arrived in the village on the afternoon train, and it was generally agreed, by those who saw him step down onto the platform with his good overcoat and his impatient manner, that grief did not appear to be sitting very heavily upon him. He was a man of perhaps 35, well dressed in the manner of a person who spent rather more than he earned, with a handsome, discontented face, and the particular restlessness of someone who found the countryside, and indeed most things outside London, faintly beneath his notice. He took a room at the Blue Boar, declined the offer of tea from the landlady with a brusqueness that did not endear him to her, and presented himself at the Laurels within the hour, where Inspector Slack was waiting for him with considerable interest. Shocking business, Gerald said, seating himself in his aunt's sitting-room with an ease that suggested he had sat there many times before, though not, perhaps, always comfortably. Poor Aunt Amelia. Can't say I'm surprised, though. Her heart, you know, never robust. We're not yet satisfied it was her heart, Mr. Fenwick, said Slack, watching him closely. Something flickered across Gerald's face. Not, Slack thought, quite the look of a man hearing entirely unexpected news. Not her heart. What do you mean? I mean the doctor has some questions about the circumstances. Nothing certain yet. We're waiting on the analyst's report. Slack allowed a pause to settle. The sort of pause he had found, in his experience, tended to make people talk. When did you last see your aunt, Mr. Fenwick? A fortnight ago. I came down for the day. Sunday it was. We had lunch. Nothing remarkable about it. And your relations with her? Cordial, would you say? Gerald's jaw tightened very slightly. Cordial enough. She was my father's sister. My only family, really, since he died. I don't see what my relations with her have to do with anything. You'll appreciate, sir, that in a case of this kind, we have to ask about everyone's relations with the deceased. Purely routine. Slack consulted his notebook, though he had no real need to. I understand your aunt was a woman of some means. I suppose she was, though I couldn't tell you the particulars. She never discussed money with me. And you're her nearest relative. Her only relative, so far as I know. Gerald rose abruptly and crossed to the window, standing with his back to the room in a manner that struck Slack as either genuine distress or a very good imitation of it. Look here, Inspector. I don't like the direction of these questions. If you're suggesting I had anything to do with my aunt's death, I'd remind you I was in London last night, at my club, and I can produce a dozen witnesses to say so. No one's suggesting anything of the kind, sir, said Slack, in the tone of a man who was, in fact, suggesting exactly that, and knew that Gerald knew it too. It was Miss Marple, walking down the high street the following morning on an errand that took her, by the most circuitous route imaginable, past the Blue Boar at precisely the hour when Gerald Fenwick was known to take his breakfast, who happened to encounter him coming out of the inn's front door, looking pale and out of temper, with a letter in his hand that he was refolding rather hastily, as though he did not wish it to be seen. "Mr. Fenwick, is it not?" said Miss Marple, with the particular gentle authority of an elderly lady who has decided that an introduction is required and does not propose to be denied one. "I knew your aunt a little, not well, I am afraid. She kept so much to herself, but one cannot live in a village for 50 years without knowing everyone by sight, at the very least. May I say how very sorry I am?" Gerald, caught rather off guard, murmured something suitably grateful, and made as if to move past her, but Miss Marple had a way of positioning herself, quite without appearing to do so deliberately, that made passing rather difficult without open rudeness. "It must be a great comfort to you," she went on, "to know that, whatever the outcome of this dreadful business, your aunt's affairs are, I am sure, in perfectly good order. She always struck me as a most careful and methodical woman. I dare say her will is quite straightforward." "I really couldn't say," said Gerald, with the stiffness of a man who could, in fact, say a good deal on the subject, and did not wish to. "I've had no communication with her solicitor as yet." Of course. "Though I did hear, but one hears so many things in a village, Mr. Fenwick, and one learns not to place too much confidence in any of it, that your aunt had spoken, quite recently, of making some changes to her arrangements. Nothing definite, you understand, only a rumour." This was not, strictly speaking, true. Miss Marple had heard nothing of the kind from anyone, but she watched, with the closest attention, the effect these words produced upon Gerald Fenwick's face, and was rewarded by seeing him go, for a moment, quite white about the mouth. "I know nothing about any changes," he said too quickly. "My aunt and I understood one another perfectly well. If you'll excuse me, I have a train to catch." He walked off down the street with the rapid, uneven stride of a man whose composure has been badly shaken, and Miss Marple stood watching him go, her expression mild and thoughtful, before turning back towards home with the satisfied air of a woman who has learned considerably more than she had any right to expect from a 5-minute conversation on a public pavement. That afternoon, calling upon Dolly Bantry at Gossington Hall on the pretext of returning a book she had borrowed some weeks before, Miss Marple learned a good deal more, for Dolly Bantry was acquainted, through her husband's business dealings, with a partner in the firm of solicitors that had long handled Miss Fenwick's affairs, and was not, by nature, a woman inclined to keep interesting information to herself. "My dear Jane, you'll never guess, though I oughtn't really to be telling you. Arthur would be furious if he knew I'd said anything, but it seems poor Miss Fenwick had been to see her solicitor only last month, about altering her will. Mr. Prescott let it slip to Arthur quite by accident, at the golf club of all places, and Arthur told me, though he made me promise not to repeat it, which of course I never do, except to you, because you're never one to gossip." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, who gossiped, in her own quiet way, a very great deal, though always in the service of establishing the truth rather than merely for the pleasure of talk. "And do you happen to know what changes she intended to make?" That I couldn't tell you. Mr. Prescott wouldn't say that much. Professional confidence and all the rest of it. But Arthur did say that whatever it was, it had made young Gerald Fenwick see red when he found out. Apparently there was quite a scene, though nobody's very clear on the details. Gerald came down specially to see her about it, some weeks back, and Annie Trent told the fishmonger's wife that she heard raised voices from the sitting room, which isn't like Miss Fenwick at all. She was always such a quiet, controlled sort of person. Miss Marple sat very still for a moment, her hands folded in her lap, her knitting for once quite forgotten. "How very interesting," she said softly. "A woman who has kept to the same habits, the same quiet routine, for 50 years, suddenly deciding, in the last weeks of her life, to change her will, and to quarrel, moreover, with the one relative who stood to benefit from her keeping it as it was. One cannot help wondering, Dolly, what could have brought about such a change of heart after so very long." "Perhaps she simply took against Gerald," said Dolly comfortably. "I know I should, if I were his aunt. Such a disagreeable young man, always wanting something." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. "Or perhaps she had learned something that made her feel her money ought to go elsewhere, to someone with a better claim upon it than a nephew who visited only when he wanted money, and who, I rather think, had grown accustomed to expecting a great deal more from her death than he is now likely to receive." She sat a while longer, turning the matter over in her mind, and thought, not for the first time that day, of a certain small greenhouse behind a screen of yew, and of a woman who had kept fresh lilies in her hall for 50 years without once explaining why. The doctor's confession. Dr. Meacham had lived in St. Mary Mead for the better part of 40 years, though it was only in the last 8, since his retirement from general practice, that the village had come to think of him as one of its permanent fixtures rather than a man who might, at any time, be called away to attend a difficult confinement or a case of scarlet fever in the next parish. He was tall, stooped now with age, with a long, kindly, weathered face, and a manner so mild that it was generally agreed he had been rather too gentle a doctor for some of his more robust patients, who preferred a man who would tell them plainly what was wrong with them. He lived alone in a small house at the quieter end of the village, called Ivy Lodge, with only a woman who came in daily to do for him, and he was known, above all else, for his garden, and in particular for a greenhouse of quite remarkable size for so modest a property, which he had built himself, plank by plank, some 30 years before, and in which he grew, among other things, lilies of a whiteness and perfection that had won him prizes at the county show on no fewer than 6 occasions. It was this greenhouse that Miss Marple found herself thinking of a great deal as she walked, on the second morning after Miss Fenwick's death, along the lane that passed Ivy Lodge on its way to nowhere in particular, a fact which did not prevent her from walking it rather more slowly than the errand strictly required. She found Dr. Meacham himself in his front garden, cutting back a rose that had gone leggy with the season, and he looked up at her approach with the unguarded pleasure of a solitary man glad of company. "Miss Marple, good morning to you. You've heard the news, I suppose. Everyone has by now. A very sad business, Dr. Meacham. I understand you and Miss Fenwick were old acquaintances." Something passed over his face. Not alarm exactly, but a kind of weariness, as of a man who has been asked a question he has long expected and never quite prepared himself to answer. "Old acquaintances," he repeated. "Yes, you might call it that. Won't you come in, Miss Marple? I was about to make some coffee, and I find I don't much care to be alone with my thoughts this morning." She followed him through to a small sitting room, comfortably shabby, with books stacked on every surface, and a fire laid but not yet lit. And while he busied himself in the kitchen, she looked about her with the frank curiosity of an old woman who considers herself entitled to it, and noted on the mantelpiece a small photograph, faded almost to sepia, of a young woman in the fashions of perhaps 50 years before, tall, dark-haired, with a face that Miss Marple, peering closer, recognized, with a small private start, as unmistakably the young Amelia Fenwick. Dr. Meacham, returning with the coffee, saw where she was looking, and did not attempt to remove the photograph or explain it away, which Miss Marple thought said a good deal for his character. "You may as well know," he said, setting down the tray with rather more care than the action required, "since I dare say it will all come out sooner or later, in a case of this kind. Amelia and I were engaged to be married, Miss Marple, a very long time ago, before you came to the village, I should think. 1898 it would have been. I was a young doctor with no money and no prospects to speak of, and her family, well, her family had other ideas. There was a suitable match already arranged, a man with land and a good name, and when I asked for her hand, her father told me, not unkindly but very plainly, that I had nothing to offer a girl of her position, and that was the end of it. And Miss Fenwick herself. Did she share her father's view? No, said Dr. Meacham, and there was, in the single word, a depth of old grief that had clearly never entirely healed over. She did not. But she was 23 and dutiful, and her father was not a man one defied lightly. She married the other fellow, Reginald Carow his name was, and I went away and took a practice in the north for some years, and told myself I would forget her, which young men always tell themselves, and which is very seldom true. And yet you came back. I came back when the practice here fell vacant, some years later. Carow was dead by then, he'd died young, no children, and Amelia had reverted to her maiden name and come to live quietly at the Laurels, as you know. I told myself it was mere coincidence that brought me back to this particular village, and perhaps it even was. But once I was here, and once I had seen her again. He stopped, and passed a hand over his eyes. We were neither of us young any longer, Miss Marple. There could be no question of marrying, after all that time, with all the talk it would have caused, and her being so set in her ways, and I in mine. But we found we could not quite let go of each other either, so we settled into a kind of understanding, a very quiet one. The Lilies, said Miss Marple softly. Dr. Meacham looked at her, and something like relief crossed his tired face, as though he were glad, at last, to speak of it to someone. The Lilies. Yes, I have grown them these 30 years, in my greenhouse there, and every week without fail I have carried a bunch to her gate before first light, when no one was about to see. It was foolish, I dare say, at our age, to behave like a pair of secret lovers out of a novel, but it was the only way either of us knew to say what we could not say plainly, after everything that had happened. She never spoke of it to me directly, not once in 30 years. But she kept them in that vase, always, and I knew she understood. And 2 mornings ago, Dr. Meacham's face changed, a slow, painful contraction, as of a man forcing himself to speak of something he would very much rather not. I did not go, he said. For the first time in 30 years, Miss Marple, I did not go. And I have asked myself 1,000 times since whether it would have made any difference if I had, whether I might have seen something, noticed something, been there to help her, if only I had kept to my habit as I always had before. Why did you not go, Dr. Meacham? He was silent for a long moment, staring into the unlit fire. Because 2 days before I had gone to see her, in the ordinary way, in the afternoon, as an old friend might call, and I had found her greatly distressed. She would not tell me the whole of it, only that she had learned something troubling about Gerald, something she felt bound to act upon, whatever the cost to family peace. She said she intended to go to her solicitor and change her will, and then, he hesitated, and then she said something that has haunted me every hour since. She said, James, I think I have been very foolish for a very long time, and I mean to put right what I can, before it is too late. I did not understand her meaning. I asked what she meant, but she would not say more, only that she had matters to settle, and that I was not to worry myself over it. And so you did not go to her the next morning, out of some misunderstanding, or some hurt feeling. Dr. Meacham looked for a moment almost angry with himself. I thought, God forgive me for thinking it, that perhaps she meant to end even our small, quiet understanding along with everything else, that whatever she had decided to put right, it might include myself. I was hurt, and foolish, and old, and I let a single morning's flowers go undelivered out of wounded pride, and the next thing I knew, she was dead, and I shall never know now what she truly meant, nor have the chance to ask her forgiveness for my sulking, which is a very poor way indeed for a man of 70 to have behaved. Miss Marple regarded him with real compassion, and for a little while said nothing at all, allowing the silence to do what words could not. "Dr. Meacham," she said at last, gently, "I do not think you have anything to reproach yourself for, beyond the ordinary foolishness we are all of us capable of, in matters of the heart, whatever our age. But I think you have given me something very valuable this morning, without perhaps quite realizing it." Miss Fenwick had learned something about Gerald that troubled her greatly in the last days of her life, something that made her wish to change her will, and made her speak of putting things right before it was too late. That is not the speech of a woman merely rearranging her affairs out of caprice. That is the speech of a woman who has discovered a wrong and means to correct it. You think Gerald— "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, rising to take her leave, "that it would be very interesting indeed to know precisely what your Amelia discovered in those last weeks that so disturbed her peace of mind. And I think, Dr. Meacham, that you may hold the key to it more nearly than you realize, if you will only think back very carefully over everything she said to you in that last conversation, not merely the words, but the manner of them, and anything, however small, that struck you as strange at the time." She left him sitting by his unlit fire with the faded photograph on the mantelpiece, and walked home with the particular brisk step of a woman who feels, for the first time since the whole sad business began, that she is very close indeed to understanding it. A letter never sent. The analyst's report came through on the third day, and it confirmed what Dr. Haydock had suspected from the first. Miss Amelia Fenwick had died of poisoning by a preparation of prussic acid, administered in the glass of sherry found beside her chair. The dose had been a heavy one, sufficient to cause death within a very few minutes, and the doctor was of the opinion, from the position in which she had been found, that she had suffered very little, had indeed very likely been dead before she had time to understand what was happening to her. Inspector Slack, armed now with certainty where before he had only suspicion, threw himself into the business of establishing where everyone had been on the night in question with renewed vigour, and it was this line of inquiry that brought him, rather to his own surprise, to a conversation with the barmaid at the Blue Boar that considerably altered the shape of his investigation. "Mr. Fenwick, sir." "Oh, he wasn't at his club that night, not that I know of, though I couldn't say for certain, of course. But I do know he wasn't in London at all Tuesday night, because my sister's girl works at the station buffet in the county town, and she's certain she served him a whiskey and soda Tuesday evening, about 8 o'clock, off the branch line that stops nearest this village. She remembered him particular, because he was that impatient with her over the change, and complained the train was late. This was, as Slack recognized immediately, a very great deal more interesting than anything Gerald Fenwick had troubled to tell him, and he lost no time in confronting the young man with it at the Blue Boar that same afternoon. Gerald, faced with the direct evidence of the barmaid's account, went first white and then a rather ugly shade of red, and attempted, for some minutes, a series of explanations that grew progressively less convincing as Slack continued to press him, until at last he abandoned pretense altogether and admitted, with poor grace, that he had indeed come down to the village on the night his aunt died. "But I never went near the house, I swear it. I came down because I'd had a letter from her 3 days before that frightened me badly, and I wanted to see her, to talk her out of whatever fool notion she'd got into her head. I walked about the village for an hour or more, working up my courage to call on her so late, and then I lost my nerve entirely and went back to catch the last train. And that's the truth of it, whether you believe me or not." "What was in this letter, Mr. Fenwick?" Gerald's jaw worked for a moment before he answered. She said she'd learned things about me, about certain debts, certain people I owed money to, people who aren't the sort you want your name connected with in polite company. She didn't say how she'd found out, only that she had, and that she was seriously reconsidering her will as a result, because she couldn't in conscience leave a fortune to a man who'd sink it in gambling debts, and worse within a 12-month. She said she meant to leave the greater part of it instead to found a cottage hospital for the district, in memory of someone she called only a friend who taught me the value of a life spent in service to others, which I took to be some sentimental nonsense about her old doctor friend Meacham, though I couldn't be sure. Miss Marple, hearing this account at second hand from Dr. Haydock that same evening, for the doctor had grown accustomed, over many years, to sharing such details with her, having learned that she generally made better use of them than he did himself, sat very still for some time after he had finished, her knitting entirely forgotten in her lap. "A cottage hospital," she repeated softly, "in memory of a friend who taught her the value of a life spent in service to others. Dr. Haydock, does that not strike you as a very particular thing to say of a man one has loved quietly, from a distance, for 30 years? It is not the language of romance at all. It is the language of admiration, of a life well spent." "I don't quite follow you, Miss Marple. I am not perfectly sure I follow myself as yet," she admitted, "but I have been thinking a great deal, these last few days, about the manner of Miss Fenwick's death, and I find myself troubled by something that has not, I think, received quite the attention it deserves. The poison was in the sherry, was it not? And yet Annie Trent tells us most particularly that her mistress took cocoa each night at 9, and nothing else, that the sherry glass was not, in the ordinary way, any part of her evening habits at all." "That's true," said Dr. Haydock slowly. "I hadn't thought of it in quite those terms, but you're right. It is odd. A woman with an evening ritual as fixed as clockwork, suddenly taking sherry, on the very night she dies, when by every account she had never been in the habit of it. Which suggests to me," said Miss Marple, "that the sherry was not something Miss Fenwick poured for herself, from her own habit, but something offered to her, by a visitor perhaps, who came to the house that evening, after Annie had gone to bed, and who brought the means of murder with them, quite prepared, expecting to find their opportunity. And that leads me to wonder very much indeed who called upon Miss Fenwick that Tuesday evening, after 9 o'clock, when Annie believed her mistress to be alone with her book, as she was every night of her life, except, apparently, that one." Dr. Haydock frowned. "Gerald says he never went near the house." "Gerald," said Miss Marple, with a faint, dry note in her gentle voice, "has already been caught in one lie about that evening, Dr. Haydock. And a man who lies about where he was is not, I think, to be trusted very far in his account of where he was not. But I confess I am not entirely satisfied that Gerald is our answer, for all his debts and his falsehoods. There is something else in this case, something to do with a letter, and a cottage hospital, and a friend who taught the value of a life spent in service, that I feel is trying very hard to tell me something I have not yet quite understood. I think, Dr. Haydock, that I must go back once more and speak to Dr. Meacham and ask him a question I ought to have asked before, not about the lilies this time, but about a rather different kind of gift. The boy who saw a car. Dr. Meacham was in his greenhouse when Miss Marple found him the following morning, moving among his lily beds with the slow, careful attention of a man who finds a kind of prayer in ordinary work. And he set down his trowel at once when he saw her coming along the path. "Miss Marple, you said you had a question for me." "I did, Dr. Meacham, and I hope you will forgive me for pressing you on a matter that must be painful. You told me that Miss Fenwick spoke, in that last conversation, of putting things right, and of a friend who had taught her the value of a life spent in service to others. I wonder whether you are entirely certain that she meant yourself by that phrase." Dr. Meacham was silent for a long moment, turning a pot of soil absently between his hands. "I have wondered that too, since you asked me to think back over her words," he said at last. "And the more I consider it, the less certain I am that she meant me at all. She never spoke of me in quite those terms, Service to others was not how she thought of what passed between us, I believe, whatever it was. But I do recall now, it came back to me only last night, lying awake, that she once spoke to me, years ago, of a young doctor she had known as a girl, before ever she met me. A Dr. Illingworth, I think the name was, who had given up a comfortable practice to work among the poor in the East End, and who had died of a fever caught from his own patients, still a young man. She spoke of him with great admiration, almost reverence, I might say, though I never had the impression there had been anything of romance in it. Only that he had impressed her, deeply, at an age when such impressions run very deep indeed. "How very interesting," said Miss Marple softly. "So the cottage hospital was not intended in your memory at all, but in memory of this Dr. Illingworth, dead these many years. That does rather change the complexion of things, does it not? For it suggests that Miss Fenwick's change of heart in her last weeks was not chiefly about romantic sentiment, or even about Gerald's failings, so much as about some renewed sense of duty, some feeling that money which had been idle, or perhaps misused, ought to be put to a better purpose before it was too late to mend matters." She thanked him and walked on, her mind working busily, and it was perhaps 2 hours later, calling at the Laurels on the pretext of returning a book of pressed flowers she claimed, not entirely truthfully, to have borrowed from Miss Fenwick some months before, that she found Inspector Slack in the small study off the sitting-room, going through the desk with the thoroughness of a man who has begun, at last, to suspect that his first search had not been thorough enough. "Miss Marple, you've a talent for turning up at interesting moments, I'll say that for you." Slack held up a folded sheet of paper, his expression that of a man who has found something and is not yet perfectly sure what to make of it. "This was pushed to the back of the drawer, under a false bottom I nearly missed altogether, the sort of thing a careful, tidy woman might use for keeping her more private papers separate from the ordinary run of correspondence. It's a letter addressed to Prescott, Hale and Prescott, her solicitors, but never sent, so far as I can tell, and never finished either." He read it aloud, and Miss Marple listened with the closest attention. "Dear Mr. Prescott, I have been going over the trust accounts these past weeks, as I told you I intended to do before finalizing the new arrangements we discussed, and I regret to say that I have found certain figures which do not tally with my own understanding of the estate's income over the past several years. I do not for one moment wish to suggest impropriety, but I must ask that a full and independent audit be undertaken before I proceed further with any changes to my will, so that I may be entirely satisfied that all is as it should be. I would be obliged if you would call upon me at your earliest." The letter ended there, mid-sentence, as though the writer had been interrupted, or had simply set it aside to finish another day, never guessing that another day would not come. "Prescott," said Miss Marple slowly, "the solicitor who handled the change to her will. Dolly Bantry mentioned him to me only a few days ago. It was through her husband's acquaintance with the firm that we first learned Miss Fenwick had been to see about altering her arrangements at all. I've had dealings with Prescott myself, over other matters," said Slack, frowning at the letter. "Respectable firm, old family business, been trustees for half the county at one time or another. I can't say I'd have looked twice at him. Which is, I think, Inspector, very often precisely the sort of man one ought to look twice at." Miss Marple's needles, forgotten in her lap, lay quite still. "I wonder, did Mr. Prescott tell you when he had last seen Miss Fenwick?" Slack consulted his notes. "He said he'd corresponded with her by letter about the new will, but hadn't seen her in person for above a month. Said the last time was a routine meeting at his office in the county town, nothing since." "And yet," said Miss Marple, "if this letter is anything to go by, Miss Fenwick had discovered discrepancies in accounts that Mr. Prescott had managed for her. Discrepancies serious enough that she felt she could not proceed with her new will until they were explained. That is not, I think, the sort of letter a solicitor would wish his client to send, especially not a solicitor who might have reason to fear what an independent audit would discover." And I wonder very much, Inspector, whether a man in such a position, learning, perhaps through some remark of Miss Fenwick's own, or through some indiscretion at his office, that his client intended to raise these very questions, might not have thought it a good deal safer to prevent that letter, and any audit that might follow it, from ever being completed at all. You're suggesting Prescott came to see her that night. I am suggesting, Inspector, that it might be worth finding out very precisely where Mr. Prescott was on the Tuesday evening in question, and whether any car answering to his was seen upon the lane that leads to the Laurels. For I recall now that young Tommy Baker, who delivers the evening papers, mentioned to his mother, who mentioned it in turn to Mrs. Hartnell, that he had seen a motor car standing at the turning near the Laurels gate rather later than usual that Tuesday, though he thought little of it at the time, being more concerned with getting home to his supper. Boys of that age so rarely trouble to look closely at a stationary car, but they are sometimes able, if pressed, to recall a colour, or a number, or some small distinguishing feature, if only someone thinks to ask them properly. Inspector Slack was already reaching for his hat. I'll have that boy found and questioned within the hour, Miss Marple. And I'll want a word with Mr. Prescott myself, a good deal more pointed than our first conversation. I think that would be very wise, Inspector, said Miss Marple, rising to take her leave, and pausing as she did so at the study window, from which one could see, quite clearly, the empty brass vase still standing upon the hall table, no one having yet thought to remove it. And when you speak to him, I wonder whether you might ask him one further question, not about the accounts, nor about the will, but about flowers. For I have come to believe, Inspector, that the answer to this whole sad business turns not upon money at all, in the end, but upon a very old habit, faithfully kept for 30 years by one man, and broken, by cruel chance, on the one morning it mattered more than any other, and upon a second man, who knew of that habit perfectly well, having visited the house often enough to observe it, and who may have found it a very convenient thing indeed to let the world believe that a missing bunch of lilies was the whole of the mystery, when in truth it was never anything more than a sad old man's wounded pride, and had nothing whatever to do with the true and far uglier reason that Amelia Fenwick died. The truth behind the lilies. It took Inspector Slack the better part of 2 days to assemble what he needed. But when at last he called upon Mr. Prescott at his office in the county town, he did so with a great deal more than he had possessed at their first meeting. Tommy Baker, the paperboy, proved a more useful witness than anyone had dared hope. Pressed gently by his mother, and rather less gently by Inspector Slack, he recalled, after some thought, that the car at the turning near the Laurels had been a dark saloon, and that he had noticed, because he was interested in such things, that it bore a number beginning with the letters that were, in fact, the first letters of Mr. Prescott's own registration. It was not, by itself, conclusive. There were other cars in the county with similar plates, but it was enough, taken with the unsent letter and a certain nervous inconsistency in Mr. Prescott's earlier account of his movements, to justify a rather more searching interview than the solicitor had bargained for. Faced with the evidence of the letter, and informed that a full audit of the Fenwick Trust accounts had already been ordered and was proceeding with the assistance of the Bank of England's own examiners, Mr. Prescott's composure, which had served him so well for so many years across the county's most respectable dinner tables, began at last to crack. It was Miss Marple, present at Inspector Slack's particular request, for he had come, in the course of this case as in others before it, to value her presence at such moments rather more than he cared to admit to his superiors, who watched the final collapse of that composure with the quiet, unsurprised attention of a woman who had expected it for some days. "I never meant for it to come to this," Prescott said at last, his hands shaking slightly as he sat in the small back room of his own office, with Slack across the desk from him and a constable at the door. "You must believe that, whatever else you believe of me. I only meant to borrow, at first, a temporary thing, to cover a bad patch, some years back, when a speculation went wrong and I could not bear the shame of my father's old firm failing under my management. I intended always to put it back. But one loan became another, and the trust accounts were so seldom examined closely. Old Mrs. Fenwick, God rest her, trusted me entirely, as her father had trusted my father before me, and the years went on, and the sum grew larger than I ever meant it to, until I scarcely knew myself how deep the hole had become. And when she wrote to you, proposing an independent audit, I knew I was finished. Prescott's voice had sunk almost to a whisper, not merely professionally, though that would have been bad enough, but there would have been criminal proceedings, certainly, and prison, at my age, with my name dragged through every newspaper in the county. I went to see her that Tuesday evening, meaning only to talk to her, to persuade her to give me time, to let me make good the deficit quietly, before any auditor need be brought in at all. I told myself that was all I intended, and instead, she would not be moved. She was very gentle about it, in her way. She said she was sorry for my trouble, and would give me what time she reasonably could, but that the audit must go forward regardless, because it was not only her own interest at stake, but the proper stewardship of money that was, in the end, not hers alone to dispose of as she pleased, money that ought, she said, to do some good in the world, now that she had come at last to understand what a life spent merely accumulating and protecting money, without ever putting it to any real use, was worth beside a life spent, as she put it, in genuine service. She spoke of some young doctor she had known long ago. I scarcely listened. I was thinking only that I was ruined, and that this frail old woman, sitting so calm and so certain in her chair, held the whole of my future in her hands, and meant to close them upon it without mercy. You brought the sherry with you, said Slack quietly. It was not a question. I had prepared it before I came. God forgive me, I had prepared it before I even knew for certain how the conversation would go, as though some part of me had already decided what I meant to do, whatever excuses I made to myself on the drive over. I told her it was a bottle from an old vintage, a small gift, something to mark the completion of the new will arrangements, whatever they should turn out to be. She was not a suspicious woman. She thanked me and let me pour it for her while she returned to her book, and I sat with her a little while longer, talking of nothing in particular, until I saw that it had done its work, and then I let myself out, quietly, by the garden door, and drove home, and told myself for 2 days that I had done nothing that would ever be discovered. There was a long silence in the small room. "There is one thing I do not understand, Mr. Prescott," said Miss Marple, speaking for the first time, in the mild, gentle voice that had, on so many previous occasions, drawn confessions from people far more guarded than the broken man before her now. The lilies. Miss Fenwick's hall vase had never, in 30 years, stood empty of a morning. Dr. Meacham brought them faithfully every week, before dawn, and left them at her gate. But on the very morning she was found dead, they had not come, for the first time in all those years, by the purest and most tragic coincidence. Dr. Meacham, wounded by a misunderstanding, having simply failed, that 1 week, to keep his old habit. And yet the whole village took that empty vase as a sign, almost a message, that something terrible had happened in the night. I wonder whether you were aware, when you left that house on Tuesday evening, that the flowers had not yet come that week, and whether it occurred to you that their continued absence, the following morning, might serve rather usefully to muddy the waters of any inquiry that followed, to suggest some deeper, more romantic mystery than the plain and sordid truth of a man protecting his own dishonesty. Prescott looked up at her with something like wonder, even in the depths of his despair. I did notice it, he admitted slowly. I had called at the house, perhaps a fortnight before, on ordinary business, and remarked to myself, as I dare say half the village had done at one time or another, on this curious habit of hers, flowers that came from nowhere, that she never explained. When I arrived on Tuesday and saw the vase already standing empty, for it happened, by chance, that the previous week's flowers had died, and been thrown out that very afternoon, Annie having mentioned it to me herself when she let me in. I confess the thought did cross my mind that it might work in my favour should anyone ever come to question the manner of her death. A woman with a secret admirer. A missing bunch of flowers on the morning she dies. It has the shape of a mystery a village loves to tell itself, and villages, once they have decided upon a story, are not always eager to look past it for the truth. "And so you very nearly succeeded," said Miss Marple, not unkindly, in letting an old man's broken heart stand as an explanation for a young solicitor's broken trust. "I am glad, Mr. Prescott, that it did not answer." It was some weeks later, on a mild afternoon with the last of the autumn sun slanting warm across her garden, that Miss Marple sat with Dr. Haydock over tea, the whole sad business now concluded. Prescott committed for trial, the trust accounts restored so far as the estate could manage it, and Gerald Fenwick, chastened by his brush with suspicion and by the discovery that his aunt's fortune was now to be divided, according to her true and final wishes, between a modest legacy for himself and a generous endowment for the cottage hospital she had long intended, gone back to London considerably subdued. "I still don't quite see how you arrived at Prescott before we did," said Dr. Haydock, helping himself to another scone. "We had the accounts under our noses for 2 days before the audit turned anything up. It was really very simple, Doctor, once one stopped being distracted by the flowers." Miss Marple's needles moved placidly as she spoke. You see, everyone in the village had fastened so firmly upon the empty vase as the great mystery of the case, and it was a very natural thing to do, for it was so very striking, so very unlike anything that had ever happened at the Laurels before. But I have found, over a good many years of observing my fellow creatures, that the most striking thing in any puzzle is very often merely a coincidence dressed up to look like a clue, while the true clue sits quietly in the corner, waiting for someone to notice it was never dressed up at all. The flowers told us only that a devoted man had, once in 30 years, let his hurt feelings get the better of his habit. A very human, very sad, but entirely innocent explanation, once one troubled to ask Dr. Meacham directly rather than simply wondering about him from a distance. The letter to Prescott, on the other hand, unfinished, hidden away, never sent, that was a genuine clue, though a quiet one, and it told us a great deal more than any amount of speculation about secret lovers ever could. A woman does not hide a letter about discrepancies in her trust accounts unless she has genuine reason to fear what those discrepancies might mean, and she does not delay sending it, once written, unless she is still hoping, out of long habit and old trust, that there is some innocent explanation she has simply overlooked. And the sherry told us that whoever poisoned her was someone she trusted enough to accept a drink from, in the ordinary way, without suspicion. Someone whose visit, at that hour, required no explanation to Annie, because Annie had already gone to bed, and someone, moreover, who knew the house and its routines well enough to time their visit for precisely that quiet hour between the housekeeper's departure and Miss Fenwick's own retirement. That ruled out a stranger, and it ruled out, I think, anyone whose visit at such an hour would have seemed remarkable rather than perfectly ordinary business. A solicitor calling upon a client about matters of business at an hour convenient to them both and inconvenient to prying eyes. That fits the facts a good deal better than a jealous nephew skulking about the lane, however guilty his conscience over his gambling debts. Dr. Haydock shook his head, with the fond exasperation of a man who had watched this particular performance many times before and never quite ceased to marvel at it. "You make it sound so very simple, Miss Marple." "It generally is simple, Doctor, in the end," said Miss Marple, setting down her knitting for a moment to pour him a second cup of tea. "It is only that people will keep dressing it up in mysteries about flowers and secret lovers, when the truth, 9 times out of 10, is a good deal plainer and a good deal sadder than anything the village imagination can invent for itself. I confess I was very glad in this instance that the sad plain truth turned out to spare poor Dr. Meacham's heart a further wound, even if it could do nothing now to mend the old one. He has promised me he means to keep bringing his lilies to the Laurels, you know, every week, just the same as always, and to leave them now upon her grave instead of at her gate. I think that a very fitting end to it all, don't you? And Dr. Haydock, looking at the small, upright figure across the tea table, with her gentle face and her quietly devastating understanding of the human heart in all its frailty, found that he agreed with her entirely.